Welcome to another edition of the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. My name is Andy Bullbarch, and as always, I'm joined by Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, Medina Gazette, and BrownZone.com, the one and only Scott Petrak. Scott, great to be joined by you again. Plenty to get into this week. Now that the Browns have one preseason game under their belt, everybody looking forward to not only the preseason game on Saturday in Indy, but a practice all week long in Indy, too. Should be a lot of fun.
It really should be, and I've never – well, I take that back. I covered joint practices against the Bills when Mike Pettin was coach. We went up to Rochester. So I did see those, but I didn't go to Tampa the last couple of years when they did it under Hugh Jackson. So I'm looking forward to seeing it again. It just feels like there's more to talk about, more to write about. You know, you get good matchups, you get different matchups. You usually get some fights. You know, we can talk about that. You know, Freddie wants to crack down on those. But I really think – it's going to be fun to watch and beneficial, and I think more valuable than the actual preseason game on Saturday.
We'll certainly get into the festivities at Indy a little bit later on here on the podcast, but I want to begin by rewinding and going back last week to get some of your general impressions of the first preseason game, and it certainly seemed like there were a lot of positives that came out of it. What do you think was a bigger moment? Baker's 2-minute drill or Damon Sheehy-Giuseppe's punt return, which certainly seemed to get a lot of people excited?
Well, I'm going to go with Baker just because we know Baker's going to be here September 8th when the season starts, and I'm not as certain about Damon Sheehy-Giuseppe. But I thought overall, it's everything you want in a preseason game, especially the opener. Just, you know the starters aren't going to play a lot. Some of them didn't even play. But to see the first-team offense score was big. Then you got enough big plays to keep you interested. Mack Wilson's 2 picks, Greedy Williams' pick, the Sheehy-Giuseppe punt return for a touchdown. So I thought just from a fan standpoint, if you're watching, it was a lot of moments to get excited about and to make you optimistic, especially about the young guys. And then from a team perspective, the ones did exactly what they wanted to do on offense, and that's what the coaches wanted to see.
And I think one of the hot topics that's come out of that punt return is the idea that there's such an incredible story attached to this young man. And it's fascinating, but, boy, it's tough, too, because he is playing in a room that all of a sudden has become the most talented and the busiest room. I mean, you talk about that wide receiver room a couple of years ago. I mean, Ray Farmer didn't put a whole lot of importance on that position, but now all of a sudden that is a very, very talented group, and there are a lot of really good guys on this roster right now that probably aren't going to be there in a few weeks.
That's exactly right. And you're right. It's made huge strides in the last couple of years, and that's one of the areas where John Dorsey got here and said, oh, my gosh, like I have to do something here. And he started by trading for Jarvis Landry, and then you get to trade for Odell Beckham Jr., you draft Antonio Callaway, you keep Rashard Higgins, and then you go get guys, lesser-known guys, the Derek Willies. You draft Damian Ratley in the 6th round. DJ Montgomery is an undrafted rookie this year who had a good day yesterday again at camp, and it continues to show up. Damon Sheehy-Giuseppe. You know, I can go down the list. Blake Jackson, who they waived with the knee injury, he's on the list. So there's a bunch of guys. Jalen Strong, he picks up off the scrap heap. He had a torn ACL. Was a former 3rd-round pick. So all of a sudden, there's guys that you watch in practice, and you go, I can see this guy making plays on Sundays, and not just the 2 big guys. So it's interesting because Sheehy-Giuseppe's going to have to at least be a credible receiver to have a shot at making this roster, in my opinion. I don't think he makes it just as a punt returner. And he's never played a lot of receiver. You know, the last time he played was in junior college. I mean, the fact that he is even in this discussion is a little mind-blowing, and I think we're a little premature when we're talking about does he make the 53-man roster. I think he still has a lot to prove. You know, the punt return came in the 4th quarter. It's against the, Washington Scrubs. He didn't do a whole lot. He just ran kind of straight, and they got some blocks and, picked it up. And it's funny, a little tangent here. He got one of the reasons he got the workout, got the extra workout with the Browns and then signed is because he ran a 4.38 40. That's a story coming out of Florida. Well, Rashard Higgins after the game and then Jarvis Landry yesterday said, we've been watching this guy practice and he doesn't look that fast. And then he thought on the punt return he looked closer to the 4.38 40. So, I don't know if he just had one crazy time because I'm watching him every day. And even on the punt return, I didn't say this guy's a 4.3 guy. So I wonder if he really has that speed. And if he doesn't, it's going to be even harder for him to stick. But it's a great story. And, you might have the argument that a couple of years ago he would have a spot on this team, but now it's just so crowded, even with the Callaway suspension. I think the Callaway suspension gives guys like Sheehy Giuseppe and DJ Montgomery and even Damian Ratley, who hasn't practiced a long time with a hamstring injury, there's an extra spot there if John Dorsey chooses to keep, that sixth receiver. But it's just a crowded room, and it's going to be awfully difficult for any of these guys to stick around, or a lot of these guys to stick around.
While we're on that topic of Antonio Callaway, I want to get into that because, this isn't a gigantic surprise. He does have a little bit of a history, and they knew that when they drafted him. And, I think at the position in which he was drafted, John Dorsey was certainly willing to take a swing. And if he ended up missing, at least now, because that room is so talented, that group is just so doggone good, you can afford a swing and miss there at that position. But, it seems like he's getting past. The suspension aside, now he can't participate with these guys, can't play until the end of September. You get the feeling that he's already been passed by a handful of guys?
That's interesting. I'm going to say yes for Rashard Higgins and no for everybody else. And the reason I say that is I think Callaway's the third most talented guy on this receiving corps. And physically, he's probably number two. He's faster than Jarvis Landry. He doesn't catch like Jarvis Landry does, and he's not as physical. But from a pure line him up, he's way faster than Jarvis Landry is. But I think the Browns knew, or I know the Browns knew that a suspension was possible when training camp started. That's one of the reasons he hasn't worked with the number ones. They said, Todd Monken, the coordinator, said he showed up out of shape. I believe that was another reason. But there's no way you practice a guy with the ones all through training camp knowing he's not going to be there for 4 games. It just doesn't make any sense. So I think that's why we haven't seen him, and it feels like he's gotten passed by these other guys, where if he wasn't going to start the suspension or start the season on suspension, he'd be getting way more work with the ones. Having said all that, number one, you're right, it's not a surprise. When you draft a guy with this kind of baggage, I think John Dorsey probably expected him to be suspended at some point. Now, if it happens again, then you have the decision. Do we cut him? Is he worth having around? He's not Josh Gordon talent, right? So you don't keep him forever. So I think this is probably his last strike with this team. That would make sense to me. They don't want to give up on him because he is so talented. And I think he could scare defenses. Given OBJ and Landry and the attention they're going to receive, I think Callaway could get one-on-one coverage without safety help and run by cornerbacks all day long if his mind is right, if he's eligible, and if that high ankle sprain heals. So they're not going to give up on him, but he can't afford to not be at the top of his game, because if he's not, and if he's not committed to being with this team, they just don't need him like they might have a year or two ago. When you contrast it to a guy like Corey Coleman. Corey Coleman kept getting these chances, and I know he's a first-round pick, but he got those chances because the Browns had nobody else. You can't say that with Antonio Callaway.
Right. Now, all the more reason why it's just fascinating with these two instances. Talking about Damon Sheehy Giuseppe. A couple of years back, he'd probably be looked at as pretty close to a lock. Antonio Callaway, you're right. A couple of years back, he'd continue to get second chances. And
it'd be huge news, right? The suspension would be huge. Yep. Even without the Odell Beckham trade, you go, oh my gosh, there's your starting receiver suspended. But all of a sudden, when you're that third guy and you're kind of in the battle with Higgins to that third spot, it was news. We wrote about it. We've talked about it. But it doesn't have nearly the same impact as it would have even a year ago.
One of the fascinating things that you do with each training camp report, you always have a camper of the day, which I find pretty interesting. And you've listed some pretty interesting names in there. I ask this because, we talk about guys that kind of burst onto the scene in these preseason games. Gets us all excited. Yeah. Are there any guys that did well in the preseason game and then they were able to really kind of capitalize on that,
sure,
rather, and then kind of take that momentum into practice and really kind of open some eyes?
It's a good question. I wrote about DJ Montgomery. I mentioned him before, is an undrafted receiver, and he was my camper of the day yesterday. And he's been overlooked in this receiver battle, and I don't think he's got a good chance to make the roster. I just think there's too many bodies ahead of him. But he shows up a lot. Maybe he's a practice squad guy. Maybe he lands somewhere else. The Giants are desperate at receiver. Maybe the Browns cut him and he winds up there. But he's a guy that looks like he can play at this level. And he showed up to me again Thursday night against Washington, and then he's continued to do that since they've been practicing after the game. So he stands out to me. I think if you look in the reverse, Mack Wilson, right? The guy had interceptions leading up to the game, the linebacker, the fifth-round pick out of Alabama, and then goes into the game and has 2 picks, right? So he's been able to build on it and then take that next step when it's live competition against a different opponent. So those are the guys that jump out to me. I thought Chad Thomas played well, the defensive end, against Washington, had a couple of impact plays early, and then we saw him go down with that neck sprain that was scary yesterday. Doesn't look like it's that big a deal. Is even supposed to travel to Indy with the team. So he hasn't been able to build on it because of that injury yesterday. But he was a guy that I think you could argue was borderline bubble guy, and the way he played against Washington made me think he's solid on this roster. You never know how the injury is going to affect it. He needs to keep building on it. But he was a guy that early on I said, oh, he's getting some reps with the 1s and 2s and showed up to me.
You're locked into the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast with Browns beat reporter Scott Petrak. And you mentioned Mack Wilson. That's a guy I want to touch on because It really seems like he's been one of those guys that defensively, especially at that position, that linebacker position with a lot of youth and a little bit of uncertainty, it really seems like he's the one guy that consistently stands out.
Yeah, he has, and it's interesting because you're always going to compare him to Sione Takitaki, right? He's a third-round pick out of BYU. They're both rookies. They're roommates in the hotel during training camp. But they're different players and different style of players. Takitaki is an aggressive, thumper, middle linebacker guy. Mack Wilson is I'm in space, I can cover running backs, I can cover tight ends, real athletic guy. So they're different, but yet you're going to want to compare them because they're both rookies and they're a couple rounds apart. So I thought Takitaki had a stronger start to camp. And now he had some issues where he was hitting guys after the whistle, and Freddie Kitchens didn't appreciate that. But you noticed him a lot. And Mack Wilson I was not noticing early. And in fact, I'm looking for him. He's down the depth chart, third-team reps. And all of a sudden, I want to say it was 2 weeks ago Saturday, he makes a diving interception, gets up like it's nothing, and starts running the other direction. Really athletic play. And then he gets an interception the next day. It wasn't a Saturday because then we go down to the stadium for the scrimmage, and he makes an interception. Winds up going 3 out of 4 days with the pick. And then you get to the game, and he has the 2 picks. And the one was really impressive. That second one where he drops in coverage, reads the quarterback's eyes, leaps, catches it on his fingertips. So he's interesting because, he's got a roster spot locked up. And going into camp, I would say it was probably 90% it was locked up. Now I think it's 100%. But I asked Freddie Kitchens the other day, I go, well, we see all these big plays. What does Mack have to do to work with the ones? Because he's not. He hasn't taken one rep with the ones. It's all Schobert and Kirksey. And he said, well, he's got to get rid of the bad plays. He goes, you see all those good plays, but you're not noticing the mistakes, right? And maybe they're just rookie mistakes, but guys make mistakes. And he said, so he's not perfect. He's still inconsistent, and you don't have that inconsistency with the veterans, right? So that doesn't mean he won't get a chance to earn time with the ones, but he's not there yet. And then I asked Mack about it yesterday, and he's like, yeah, I think about that. I wonder, he goes, but I got to keep doing what I'm supposed to do. And he said his head's still swimming a little bit because they want him playing all 3 linebacker spots. And that's a lot. And you get your head in the playbook, and you go from Sam, strong side one day, to Will, the weak side the next day. Then they even asked him to play the middle, and he goes, that's not what I'm used to doing. So he's a true Will guy, right? He's a weak side guy. He can run and chase and cover. But the Browns want to see versatility out of him. And it'll be interesting to see if he and or Takitaki can break into that lineup and steal some playing time from Schobert and Kirksey. Because obviously General Manager John Dorsey felt the linebacker position was a weakness because he went and drafted 2 of them. But yet you have a proven commodity in the veterans. I'm fascinated to see how all that plays out.
You think Wilson plays with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder because he was drafted where he was drafted? He played on a prominent program defense, right? That's always near the top of this, of the every single ranking in college football. Yet he fell down to the 5th round.
I do, and it's interesting because people, some of the draft analysts had him going high, like he might have been the 2nd or 3rd inside guy, and he winds up dropping to the 5th round. Now I know I talked to Nick Saban right after the draft about Mack Wilson, and he wasn't thrilled that he came out early. He thought he would have been better suited to stay another year, work in that Alabama system. And obviously, part of Nick saying this is that he wanted him back. He thought he would help his team. But he also didn't think he was going to go in the first 2 rounds. And that's Nick Saban's philosophy. You're not going to go early. Come back and improve that draft stock. And Mack Wilson, for family reasons and the fact that he thought he was ready to go, left. So I think all that contributed to him falling to the 5th round. But if you look at him, you can tell he's an NFL player. Now, that doesn't mean, he'll be great in the playbook. And, there's a long way to go between looking like an NFL player and playing like an NFL player. But he's got those physical attributes. And it would have been interesting to see if he had stayed at Alabama, if he becomes a first-round pick, if he becomes a second-round pick, because maybe another year of seasoning under Saban would have done that for him. But if you're a Browns fan, we got him in the 5th round, which is a steal, and maybe he gets that seasoning here, and by next year is ready to walk in and be one of those starters that they're counting on.
And the linebacker position, you talked about how John Dorsey clearly thought that might be at least a little bit of a weakness. Yeah. That's why he spent some picks on that position. One of the things we kind of thought going into camp was that the guys in front of them would certainly alleviate some of those concerns, because that defensive line unit, boy, oh boy, all kinds of talent. But the depth is definitely being tested here in camp. A lot of these guys going down pretty quickly. And you mentioned Chad Thomas, but it looks like he's going to be okay. Should we be concerned at all with that?
I don't think so. It was a really good sign. I want to say it was yesterday's practice. We saw all 4 starting defensive linemen practice in team drills, and it had been weeks since we had seen that. Sheldon Richardson was the last guy to come back. So when you have those 4, it's an impressive group. And then when you look at the depth, Freddie Kitchens has been saying for weeks, this is the strength of the team. And you go, okay, I get it. I get the front 4, but let's talk about depth. Well, let's start inside. You got Trevin Coley, who started a bunch of games the last 2 years. Now, he's a run stuffer more than a pass rusher, but you can argue if you need a guy like that or not. I think he makes a team. Some people think he's a bubble guy. Daniel Ukulele, I'm screwing his name up all the time. He is flashed. Devereaux Lawrence, number 99, showed up again in the game Thursday night. Has shown up in practice and gotten some reps with the ones when Richardson was down, when Larry Ogunjobi was down. So all of a sudden you see some depth at tackle. And then on the edge, you have Chris Smith, who's a versatile guy, can play inside and outside. Get Jannard Avery, who's back off the ankle injury, which was scary for a while, but now he's back and looks good. I thought he had 2 sacks in practice the other day, virtual sacks. And then you have a Chad Thomas, right? So that's 3 guys, and you might only keep 2 at the end. So you're talking I think the line is 8, 9, maybe even 10 deep. So I do think they have the depth they're looking for. Now, we know that they went after Gerald McCoy. We know they went after Mike Daniels. So I think John Dorsey might want the one real difference-maker pass rusher at tackle to add to that 3-man rotation. But if he doesn't get it, I think there are options like Devereaux Lawrence that can pop up out of nowhere, or you can slide Chris Smith inside. So I don't think when everybody's healthy, I don't think depth is a concern, and I really do think that could be the strength of this team.
Going to the other side of the trenches now and taking a look at what's going on with the offensive line, a lot of the focus has been on the right guard spot, and it seems like nothing is settled there at all. And should that be unsettling to Browns fans, knowing that nothing is settled? I mean, at this point, people have been looking at Corbett, waiting for him to take charge, and, boy, it just doesn't look like he's ever going to do that in camp.
Well, and that is disappointing. And I'm working on an Austin Corbett story. I sat down with him. All these days run together. Every time I go to say a day, I'm like, one of these days over the weekend, I sat down with Austin Corbett for a long time, and we had a one-on-one, and we talked about expectations with being the number 33 pick, and does he still have a chance to win the job, and the switch going from left tackle to right guard, that he played left tackle all his time at Nevada. So, I'm hoping to get that story done either before I leave for Indy or when I'm in Indy. My point being, it is disappointing because you don't draft a guy number 33 and expect him not to be a starter. And you don't trade Kevin Zeitler for Olivier Vernon and open a spot and then he doesn't win it. So I think it's too early to say he won't win the job, but it's not looking good. Eric Kush has been there for a week now. Corbett's spending an awful lot of time working at center, second-team center, because they're trying to get him ready to be that swing interior backup guy if he doesn't win the starting right guard job. I talked to Joe Bitonio yesterday and asked him about Corbett, and he thinks he's still got, he still thinks he has a bright future. doesn't think his confidence is shot, but talks to him about that, about, hey, you're an NFL guy. Don't get down about this. Keep working. You're going to be fine. It just might take longer. So I think we have to keep an eye on Corbett to see if he really is a bust. It's too early to label him that, but you can't go much further into your NFL career without being labeled a bust, especially when you're that high a pick. And again, it's not his fault he's the number 33 pick, but that's what happens when you are. So having said all that, right guard, a concern that nobody seized it. Freddie Kitchens did not rave about Eric Kush against Washington, said he was up and down, plenty of bad plays. He's not the front runner to win the job, even though he's getting the reps with the first team. So reason to be concerned, yes. If the other four guys on the line play above average and you have a really good quarterback, you can live with one guy across that line that isn't a stud, but he needs to be good enough. And the question is Eric Kush that guy? He started 7 games last year, but he's kind of a journeyman. Can Corbett step in? So reason to be concerned, but not reason to panic, because I think you can kind of ham and egg it at one inside spot on the offensive line.
And taking a look now at the bigger news that kind of went down almost a day or two after you and I wrapped up the podcast last week, and we've touched on the whole Duke Johnson saga, I think, in every episode, and this may be the last time we touch on it because the deal finally went down, but it didn't really get met with mixed reactions the way I thought, because I think many people believe that he wasn't in camp simply because he wanted to be traded. Of course, it was a hamstring injury. That was the official word that kept him out. And I think people were just expecting him to finally be dealt. And anytime you deal a guy like that, that's been durable, I mean, he's put up some pretty good numbers. You look and see, 4th-round pick, it could end up being a 3rd-round pick. Some people look at that and get disappointed, and then there are others that look at it and say, you know what? He didn't want to be here anyway, so to get a 3rd or 4th-round pick, that's not so bad.
Well, sure. And we, like you said, we talked about this plenty of times. I was not in favor of trading Duke because I don't trust Dontrell Hilliard yet to be that number 2 guy until Kareem Hunt comes back, assuming Kareem Hunt comes back. And I like Duke. I have a soft spot for Duke. I think he's a really good player that adds a lot of value to your team. Having said all that, one of the reasons I didn't think they should trade him is because I didn't think they'd get a 4th-round pick back. If you look at the history of running back trades, that doesn't happen, right? Jordan Howard got traded from Chicago to Philly, I think, for a 6th-round pick, and he had big numbers last year.
Yeah.
And Duke didn't have big numbers. So I'm surprised. I'm shocked. John Dorsey was able to get a 4th-round pick that can turn into a 3rd-round pick depending on how many games Duke's active next year for Houston, or this year for Houston. So I'm shocked that he was able to get that. I don't know if he took advantage of the fact that Houston doesn't have a real GM and that Coach Bill O'Brien's handling that and that they must have been desperate for a running back. But whatever it is, John Dorsey showed incredible patience by hanging on to Duke, and it served him well. On top of that, I don't think Duke needed to be traded because Duke was unhappy. It all started with the Browns signed Kareem Hunt February 11th, and then they put Duke on the trade block. So I don't like the narrative that Duke started this because he didn't. He didn't sign Kareem Hunt. He didn't put himself on the trade block. Now, he reacted and said, trade me because you already put me on the block. But John Dorsey, as soon as he traded Kareem Hunt, knew that Duke was expendable, and he let it slip in the first press conference about Kareem Hunt that Duke's not expendable yet. Well, as soon as you say that, it means he's expendable. So I think all those things led up to the trade, and it's fine, and I think it will probably serve Houston well. I think it'll serve the Browns well because in order to get the fact that they got that draft pick back for Duke Johnson is a steal, and theoretically – you get Kareem Hunt back week 10. All you got to do is get through 8 games with Dontrell Hilliard as your number 2. And the Browns like him. The coaches like him. The key will be that Nick Chubb stays healthy. Because if Nick Chubb stays healthy for 8 games, you're only counting on Hilliard for X number of snaps. That's fine. And if you don't trust Hilliard, you can go get another veteran back to fill that void for 8 games. The issue will be if Chubb gets hurt, Duke could have stepped in. I personally am not confident that Hilliard can step in and be good enough to get you through those 8 games.
Going to be interesting because if Chubb does indeed go down at any point throughout the season, with or without Duke, that's definitely a step back. But you're right. You have somebody that can certainly step in and replace him if Duke was still around. Well, the next few days, Browns are in Indy.
Yeah.
And it's been a really physical camp so far. I know you've hit on that many times, and that seems to be the theme of this camp, the fact that it's been very, very physical. Really no reason to think that's not going to continue, right, when they start practicing against somebody else?
No, it will. And I think in any other camp situation, you go to Indy, and these would be the most physical practices of camp. Now, I'm not guaranteed that they will be just because Freddie Kitchens' camp has been so physical and brutal, and they've been in pads 11 out of 12 possible days, and they've tackled. And they're not going to tackle in Indy. They'll wear pads, and they'll hit, but they're not going to tackle to the ground just for safety reasons, and they're going to wait until the game on Saturday. So I'm not convinced it'll be quite as physical, but I know they'll be fun. And that's the thing about going to practice against somebody else. I think the work is good, and you get a better gauge, right? You get, we saw the preseason game. The first team played 7 snaps. Well, they're going to probably go, and I'm just off the top of my head, let's say they go 50 snaps, ones versus ones in Indy. That's a lot of good work. And it's Larry Ogunjobi against Quentin Nelson, assuming Nelson, he's been dealing with an injury, but let's say he's healthy, right? That's a great matchup. And it's a different matchup than Ogunjobi versus Cush and Ogunjobi versus Bitonio every day. So you get to vary it up. You get to see Denzel Ward versus T.Y. Hilton, right? And not that Denzel's not going against great receivers, but it's a different receiver, and you get a different skill set that you have to match. And you can see those across positions and across the roster and across first team, second team, third team. So you get a lot of good work. You get a lot of good evaluation tools. The only concern is that when the Browns practice against the Browns and the Colts practice against the Colts, they are really cognizant of not hurting each other because you don't want to take down your teammates. Well, that goes out the window when you're practicing against a guy from somebody else, right? I mean, Darius Leonard for the Colts doesn't care if Nick Chubb sprains his ankle. I mean, maybe at some level he does, but you know what I'm saying. So in the back of your mind, I think you're always worried about a guy getting hurt because somebody's not being careful. But obviously the Browns have weighed that and feel this is more beneficial. And the fact is, it just fits in with Freddie Kitchens' philosophy of toughness and building physicality. And he went on a rant yesterday how it's a culture shock to the players, and I think he's right. I mean, first of all, I don't remember the practices being this long and this physical for years, right? I mean, since the collective bargaining agreement changed. And the pads, I mean, every day they're in pads. These guys don't like being in pads, right? The collective bargaining agreement states that once you get to the season, you can only be in pads once a week, and then it's 14 total for the whole season. So Freddie knows that, and he's loading up, and he's getting guys ready because he knows he's got to take them out of pads once you get to the season. But it's interesting. I haven't heard guys complaining yet, and I think that's because they like Freddie. He's new. We all know the expectations for this team. But if Freddie did this year 2, you might hear some complaining. If the expectations weren't as high, I think you might hear some complaining too, because it's been that physical and that rigorous for these guys, and I'm sure they're beat up by now, and I'm sure they're worn down a little bit.
Yeah, and we're not quite halfway through the preseason
right.
yet either, so going to be interesting to see how that develops. All right, Scott, busy week lined up in Indy. Be on the lookout for that for sure over the next few days here to see how things are going down in Indianapolis, and I know that you'll be back here over the weekend, right? You're not going to be there for the game. You'll be there for the practices, not the game.
Right. We decided do we spend a whole week in Indy? Do you save, how are we going to handle this? So I thought that the practice would be more beneficial. So I'm going to go to the practices, and then because of that day off, it just didn't make sense from a contingency standpoint to stay in Indy that whole time. So I'll be at the practices, and then back home, and then we get back at it again next week, getting ready for the trip to Tampa for the Browns.
Good stuff, and that'll be the dress rehearsal, right, against Tampa?
Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of that phrase, but the fact is that's the time you see the starters the most. They might not even play in the 4th game. So, if you're going to watch one preseason game, it's week 3 for sure.
Absolutely. Well, it's come to that point in the show where we take a look at your golf game. You mentioned to me earlier you were able to get out a couple times since our last podcast. So what was your golf shot of the week?
I'm going to go with, I'm going to give you 2. One of them's mine, one of them's not. I played Pleasant Valley last week, which is one of my favorite places to play down in Medina. And I hit it okay. I hit I hit a really good 3-wood. It's a par 5, number 6. I was kind of behind a tree, and I hit a choke down, like half swing punch 3-wood, and I hammered it right up the right side. It was a perfect shot, and it was just a shot that you don't hit a lot, but it did exactly what I wanted it to do, which doesn't happen all the time. Unfortunately, I tried to hit a little easy pitching wedge into the wind and hit it over the green and made bogey. But the 3-wood was a memorable one. And then on the next hole, actually, a sports editor, Kevin April, who's a good golfer and took $4 off me on that because he got up and down for bogey on 18 to win the match by a stroke or by a hole. But on the next one, it's a par 3. It's about 155, 165, number 7 at Pleasant Valley. And it always plays longer, but it was downwind. The tees were up a little bit. And he hit a little rescue club. I'm thinking, as he's hitting, I'm going, that's too much club. But he hit it great, and he took a little easy swing, and it's going right at it. It lands just on the fringe and trickles up. It's rolling right at the stick, and I'm thinking, we're going to have to put that he used a rescue club on a 155-yard hole. Like, that's going in my mind. It's going in the paper because he's making an ace. And it hit the flag stick and shot 20 feet away.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't even going that hard. It could have easily hit and dropped. Instead, it just clicked the right side, went 20 feet away, and he left the birdie putt just on the edge, so he made par. But I thought I was going to see the second hole-in-one that I've ever seen, and it would have been cool.
Wow, that would have been really awesome. Well, that's all right. You know what? It was a pin seeker, right?
It was.
Nothing wrong with that.
It looked good the whole way. It really did. It was a fun shot to watch.
Good stuff. Well, should be a lot of fun to keep your eyes on brownzone.com all week long as well. Scott's going to be at Indy over the next few days here as well, and you and I will get a chance to do this again next week, my friend. Always a pleasure, and should be a lot to talk about after a full week of practice in Indy and then that second preseason game as well.
Yeah, and then we're getting close to the regular season, so it's good. It's amping up. You can feel it amping up.
Absolutely. All right, well, that's going to wrap up this week's edition of the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Bullbarch saying thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you again next week. Catch you again next week. Catch you again next week. Catch you again next week.